Hey, what's going on, everybody? I'm Sam. I am a student of the Bible. I am a pastor. I've been a pastor for 22 years now, and I'm a writer. And my training involves biblical studies, theology, biblical languages. We have been running through Genesis, and so we've gone all the way through Genesis chapter 4. We are in Genesis chapter 5. And like I said in the last video we did on Genesis, we're going to notice some things once we hit to Genesis chapter 5 now. Because if we're paying attention and reading very carefully in the text, even in the English Bibles, things start to feel a little different. They start to feel a little weird. And in the Hebrew Bible, they specifically feel a little weird because some names in the English, they look like each other. Like a set of names here is going to start looking like a set of names from Genesis chapter 4. But in Hebrew, they really look like each other. I'm going to put some the Hebrew comparisons up on the screen so we can kind of see them. But there's a couple different theories about this, okay? So if you are someone who ascribes to the Mosaic authorship, one author, Moses, all the way through the Torah, the Pentateuch, then Genesis chapter 5 is something that you have to deal with. And we would have to try to figure out how that would work, and we try to keep ourselves from tying ourselves in a pretzel and kind of doing circular reasoning and all that kind of stuff. But Genesis 5 is odd, and there's quite a few reasons why Genesis 5 is odd. One of the main reasons that Genesis 5 is odd is because it feels like when you begin to read it that it ignores everything that's come before it. The only thing that it may not feel like it ignores is Genesis chapter 1, especially when you read it in Hebrew, because there are some familiar ideas, familiar names of who God has been described as. But it really, and there's some familiar ideas from Genesis chapter 1 that are going to pop right back up in Genesis chapter 5. In fact, if you ever have time to do this, take Genesis chapter 1. All the way through Genesis chapter 2, verse 4a, the beginning of Genesis 2:4, and then put Genesis 5:1 right after it and see how it reads together. It's a fascinating experiment because it almost seems like it should have flowed together like that. But if you read Genesis chapter 5, you start asking questions. I do anyway. Questions like, where's Eve? Why isn't Eve ever mentioned ever again? Where are mentions of what happened with Cain and Abel? Why isn't Cain in the text here at all? Cain isn't ever mentioned ever again. His whole lineage never mentioned again, kind of. All we see here in Genesis chapter 5 is what feels like a restart to the story. We see Adam, we see Seth, and we see this lineage through Seth all the way to Noah. That's what's going on in Genesis chapter 5. And so if we want to hold to Mosaic authorship, we have to deal with what just happened. And the only way really to do that is to say, well, the most important people here are the men, which I'm not sure that's what the route we want to run. And the stories that came before it aren't as important as the stories that are about to happen. And then we would take the end of Genesis chapter 4 where it says that Adam knew his wife Eve and they conceived again, and she named her son Seth, and that name Seth means granted. It probably means that, kind of means that, because she says that God has granted me another child in place of Abel because Cain killed him. And so that kind of sets up at the end of chapter 4, and then chapter 5 seems to go, let's run with Seth, and let's run that way. Now, if you are someone who ascribes to the documentary hypothesis of how the Torah was written, just kind of quick refresher, the documentary hypothesis says that there's not one single author to the book of Genesis. There's not one single author to the Torah. There are multiple authors, multiple editors over time. That these accounts are taken from different sources and kind of stitched together, and that some of the sources were actually in correction of some of the things that were already written. And so the documentary hypothesis, when it first came out a couple hundred years ago, they would have said, Genesis chapter 1 was a later addition to Genesis, and Genesis 2, 3 were kind of the original story of creation and the fall, and then Genesis chapter 4 was like its own thing that got stitched in there with Cain. Genesis chapter 5 is actually part of whatever Genesis chapter 1 is about. And so they got all these things kind of moving around, and they kind of tried to stitch them all together. And then that's been kind of refuted is not the right word. It's been challenged to be looked at differently. It doesn't mean that it has been like done away with. It has been kind of updated and kind of reconfigured to be to think about it better, because they used to think of there was these 4 sources, right? There was the priestly source, there was the Deuteronomist source, there was the Elohist source, and the Yahwist source. And you would kind of see how and they got named that way because of what they did. So the priestly source is a lot of Leviticus in that, a lot of the higher version of who God is, that kind of stuff. The Deuteronomist source is like Deuteronomy, and that's it. The Yahweh source and the Elohist source kind of bounce around. And the danger is to try to think of this as, well, anytime the name of God changes, that's the Yahweh source, this is the priestly source, this is the Elohist source. It's not that easy, it's not that simple, and it's not all, things don't happen like that. What it really is that it's a literary thing that goes on, and we're going to see that actually right here in chapter 5. There's a if the documentary hypothesis is true, then chapter 5 is definitely a stitched in thing, because that may be one of the only ways to explain it and have it make sense from a literary standpoint, from why God's name keeps changing back and forth, why these names sound so much like the names in Cain's lineage, all that kind of stuff. And so this is not like I think amongst biblical scholarship, they mostly go with the documentary hypothesis. I don't know too many biblical scholars who still ascribe to Mosaic authorship. Even amongst conservative scholars, I think that's the tradition. I think that's a lot of what you'll find in church. That's a lot of what you'll find with some rabbinical teachings, that kind of stuff. But not a lot of critical biblical scholars are hanging on to Mosaic authorship anymore. That doesn't mean they're doing away with Moses as an author of this or a part of this. What they're saying, though, is that maybe there's multiple sources that get pulled in. Maybe Moses had his hand in a couple of these things. We don't know, but it seems like there's a lot more that's going on here than just one author who lived back then writing all these things. And so that's kind of the debate that's going back and forth. Anyway, let's jump right into the text, and then I want to show you a chart that I made to kind of pair these two lists of names and kind of say, hey, what's going on here? Now, here's what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that this is exactly a one-for-one thing, that Genesis 5 borrows all of Cain's lineage names, puts them in there, and says this is how that actually worked, or that it was a corrective thing. It could have been. It could have been that if Genesis chapter 5, if the documentary hypothesis is true and Genesis chapter 5 is the priestly account, then it could have been that Genesis 4 is the older account with Cain's lineage, and they didn't want to do anything with that, and they just kind of said, no, we're going to correct that, took all the names from Cain's lineage, put them into Seth's lineage, and created something different. It could have been that. I don't know. It just doesn't tell us that. And what we're going to see, though, it may feel like that. It may seem like that. So I just want to point these things out to us, okay? So this is the account of Genesis chapter 5 in the NIV, and I think this is where we have to start asking some big questions, okay? So it says this is the written account of Adam's family line. You would think that they would have said, here's Eve, and then Cain and Abel, and Cain killed Abel, and then they had Seth, and then they kind of went from there. Cain was banished. No mention at all. Look what it says here. This is the written account of Adam's family line. When God created mankind, he made them in the likeness or the image of God. He created them male and female and blessed them, and he named them Adam, or mankind, when they were created. No Ish, no Isha, no any of this kind of stuff. It's just, it sounds a lot more like Genesis 1, right? They're created in the image of God, male and female, he created them together in the image of God. He named them mankind, Adam. Like it's hearkening back to Genesis 1 language. And oh, by the way, right here, when God created mankind, God here is the word Elohim. When God created mankind, when Elohim, so we're back to just using Elohim. In Genesis chapter 2 and 3, it was Yahweh Elohim. In Genesis chapter 4, it was just Yahweh. Now in Genesis chapter 5, we're back to Elohim, just like we were in Genesis chapter 1. And so this is another clue. So the phrasing and the wording that's going on here is very Genesis chapter 1. God's name that they're using is very Genesis chapter 1. And look what's missing. Verse 3, when Adam lived 130 years, he had a son in his own likeness, in his own image, and he named him Seth. After Seth was born, Adam lived 800 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Adam lived a total of 930 years, and then he died. No mention of Eve. No name, not even like his wife, like whatever. It's just not even in the story anymore. No mention of Abel, no mention of Cain. But that he had Seth. After 130 years old, he has Seth. And then Seth's lineage gets named. He has other sons, other daughters, it says, but Seth is the most important one to pay attention to. Okay? And then it says this, when Seth had lived 105 years, he became the father of Enosh. And after he became the father of Enosh, so these are the two names that match up to Genesis chapter 4. And so if you are writing later on, and you know the story of Genesis chapter 4, and you know about Seth, and you know about Enosh, because they're both mentioned in Genesis chapter 4, and you want to make a corrective of what's going on here, that maybe what you do is you add those names in, and the positive line, and then you borrow a bunch of names from Cain's lineage, put them in there, and say this is how it really worked. Or maybe there was a dispute over which one was the more accurate one, which one actually to them was history. I don't know the answer to that, but watch what happens after Enosh, because all of a sudden things sound familiar. Okay, so after he became the father of Enosh, Seth lived 807 years, had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Seth lived a total of 912 years, and then he died. There's a lot of debate amongst biblical scholars on whether these numbers are accurate and true. I used to call this like youth pastor math. Yeah, 912 years, sure. Like, kids would show up. How many kids did you have last night? Like 350. There's like 25 kids in the room. But that's the way I think a lot of biblical scholars view this. They kind of go, the old show, Whose Line Is It Anyway? When they would say like the numbers are made up and it doesn't even matter. That's kind of the way that biblical scholars look at these numbers, okay? The people weren't actually living this long. I don't know the answer to that. I have no idea. And I don't think any of us can really know for sure. But we're just going to take the text for what it says for right here in the story and kind of run with it for now and see where it gets us, okay? It says, altogether, Seth lived a total of 912 years, and he died. When Enosh had lived 90 years, he became the father of Canaan. That name should sound familiar. Canaan. In some versions of the Bible, it says Canaan. Actually, Cainan, okay? Canaan. And if you look at the Hebrew, Cain's name is Cain, right? And Canaan's name is Cainan. Cainan. There's one extra consonant there. It's the same name with one extra consonant. So I think that's fascinating. Okay. Anyway, Canaan. After he became the father of Canaan, Enosh lived 850 years. He had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Enosh lived a total of 905 years, and he died. When Canaan had lived 70 years, he became the father of Mahalalel. Okay, Mahalalel. Now, Mahalalel sounds an awful lot like Mahuiel, who is the son of Irad, who is the son of Enoch, who's the son of Cain, right? So, and it's actually spelled almost identical. And what you have in Mahuiel is you have a Vav and you have a Yod in the middle. And in Mahalalel, you have just two Lameds in the middle of the name. In the same exact spot. Everything else is the same name. It's like they just said, hey, we're going to take two letters out here, put two letters here, and it changes the name. So I think that's kind of fascinating. I said in one of my other videos, it's like saying, in this lineage we have Sam, and in this lineage we have Sham. Okay, so that's kind of what's going on here. So it says we have Mahalalel, and after he became the father of Mahalalel, Canaan lived 840 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Canaan lived a total of 910 years. Then he died. When Mahalalel lived 65 years, he became the father of Yared or Jared. There's no J in Hebrew. Okay, it's the Yod there. So Yared. Okay. In Cain's line, there is an Irad. And guess what? One letter difference on the front end between Irad, which has that extra letter in the front end, and Yared, same letters. The same ending through the stem is like the same of Yared and Irad. Okay, there's it's just I'm gonna put this up here probably while I'm saying all this. I don't have it up now. I will later though, add it in later. But you can see these names. So I put little like lines next to them. You can see all of how they're all connected and how they look a lot alike, minus like one or two letters. Okay, so there's Yared or Yared. He's the son of Mahalalel. After he became the father of Yared, Mahalalel lived 830 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Mahalalel lived a total of 895 years, and he died. When Yared had lived 162 years, he became the father of Enoch. Well, guess what? Cain has a son named Enoch in his line also. It comes in a different place, but there you go, right? After he became the father of Enoch, Jared lived 800 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Jared lived a total of 962 years. Then he died. When Enoch had lived 65 years, he became the father of Methuselah, or if you want to say it in like the Hebrew name, Methuselah. Okay, well, guess what? In Cain's line, there is a Methusael. Okay, Methusael. And they are also very similar, except the last two letters in their name are different. So once again, really fascinating. And so here is, we like to say Methuselah, but it's Methuselah in Hebrew. And after he became the father of Methuselah, Enoch walked faithfully with God 300 years. And he had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Enoch lived a total of 365 years. Enoch walked faithfully with God, and then he was no more because God took him away. Now, there is a fan fiction account called the Book of Enoch that if you can get your hands on, it's fascinating. It's weird. It's got a bunch of like apocalyptic literature, like Enoch goes up into heaven, he gets taken by aliens kind of away, like angels away. It talks about there's just a lot in it. If you want to read it, it's fun. You just need to know it was written as kind of like a fan fiction thing about what's going on with Enoch here. Okay, it wasn't really Enoch who wrote it. Anyway, so Enoch has Methuselah, then he's gone. When Methuselah had lived 187 years, he became the father of Lamech. Well, if you pay attention, there was a Lamech in Cain's line. In fact, Lamech was the first one recorded in the Bible who had two wives, and he's the one who's like, if Cain was avenged 7 times, me 77 times because I killed a guy. And but there's also a Lamech in Seth's line here. And so then it says this: Methuselah lived 782 years. He had other sons and daughters. Altogether, he lived a total of 969 years, and then he died. The oldest man recorded in Scripture, right there. When Lamech had lived 182 years, he had a son, and he named him Noah. Okay, he named him Noah, and Noah actually is this Hebrew word that sounds like another Hebrew word that means comfort, that means like rest or comfort. And so that was Noah. And so he said when he had this son named Noah, he will comfort us in the labor and painful toil of our hands caused by the ground the Lord has cursed. So this, if the documentary hypothesis is true, and this is the priestly account that's tied into Genesis 1, this is the first time we've ever heard of a curse. We've ever heard that there's a problem with creation. We know from 2 and 3 and 4, there's all kinds of problems. There's craziness going on. But if the documentary hypothesis is true, then this would be the first time the curse would have been mentioned by the priestly account. Right? So after Noah was born, Lamech lived 595 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Lamech lived a total of 777 years. And then he died after Noah was 500 years. He became the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And we're going to find out how those boys actually shaped the landscape of the known world at the time with their kids and how they spread out all over the world. So anyway, the whole of chapter 5 is just like this genealogy. But here, look, just take a look. I think I might have already put this up on the screen. Like I said, I'm going to do this after the video. But you can see all these lines that I've drawn all over the place where all these names kind of match up. And I just think it is really interesting. I'm not going to make any statements on if this is Genesis 5 borrowing from Genesis 4, because Genesis 4 is clearly the earlier account. But you wonder if these names are borrowed, changed, put in the account to make it make sense, then maybe they thought they were going to replace Genesis 4 with Genesis 5. But they ended up just being stitched next together in the scroll, and no one ever corrected. They're like, guess we'll just have both accounts of these lineages because Seth's mentioned here, so I guess we can have it together and then kind of keep it together. I don't know if that's exactly what happened. It could be one author. Who knows? I wish that we could go back in time and see what happened, but we're doing the best we can. Critical scholars and archaeologists are doing the best they can to try to figure out a lot of this and how this all fits together. And we make hypotheses, we test those things and see what comes out in the wash. But it certainly seems like Genesis 5 is this stitch and a restart to the story. And we're going to get into Genesis 6 in our next video and talk about weird. We might bring back Enoch and talk about that a little bit before we get to 6, because when we get to the beginning of 6, it might be some of the weirdest stuff. There's some weird stuff in the Bible, but this might be some of the weirdest, like, out there, like, stuff that is here. And actually the book of Enoch talks about Genesis chapter 6. And then it's referenced by New Testament. The book of Jude actually references the book of Enoch, references this whole thing here. And we're going to talk more about the divine council that we talked about before. All right, so that's Genesis 5. Hope you enjoyed that. Maybe it's going to spur up a lot of different discussion and thoughts. And that's exactly what I want to do. I want to try to... one of the things I've loved about Genesis, when I was younger, I would just read it like straightforward. And kind of just go, everything's literal, whatever. But the more I engage with the text, the more I just don't care. I love the text for what it is. I love the text for what it teaches me about who God is, about who I am, about what this life is about, what happened, why we are the way we are, all that kind of stuff. And I love seeing the beauty of the language and how it all works together. And so hopefully you do too. All right, give me a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.